Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Centre in this new academic year. And indeed, welcome to the Centre's Wednesday seminar series, this term on Islam and biomedicine. This is a series I'm convening with my colleague, Dr. Asim Padella, from the Islam and Medicine Unit at the University of Chicago. And we are indeed fortunate to have the support from Templeton for our wider project called Conversations on Islam and the Human Sciences. Now, advances made in the human sciences, particularly the medical and the life sciences, has created a knowledge gap, as it were, which have left some in the Muslim world feeling uncertain, while Muslim scholars, their ulama and theologians struggle to integrate their doctrines with the latest scientific and medical research. So this series attempts to address this gap by encouraging scholarly conversations, by bridging traditional Islamic theology, metaphysics, and issues arising out of the field of biomedicine. So more specifically, our wider project, supported by Templeton, will engage with the question of integration. How might scientific knowledge inform and work with the various Muslim theologies on the nature of being and life? So we're very fortunate indeed today that we have Dr. Mehrunisha Suleman from the University of Cambridge. So she will be speaking on Muslim values and end-of-life healthcare decision-making, values, norms, and ontologies in conflict. Dr. Mehrunisha Suleman is doing her postdoc work at the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. Her research involves an analysis of the experiences of end-of-life care services in the UK from the Muslim perspective. Before going to that other place, Mehrunisha completed a DPhil in population health here in Oxford. Of course, that was only an interlude for her, for she in fact did her BA in the biomedical sciences originally at that other place. So she worked with Sir Muay Gray on the Department of Health's QIPP, which I do not have any clue as to what that means, Right Care Program, and was involved in the design and construction of population-based accountable integrated care systems, as well as developing an online tool for commissioners, clinicians, and patient groups on healthcare systems design. She was co-editor of the NHS Atlas of Variation for Diabetes and Liver Disease. Well, that is all, folks. Give a very warm welcome from that who has come from the other side to here. Thank you.
Dr. Fifi. Thank you so much to Dr. Asim and to OSIS for inviting me today. And thank you so much for that very kind introduction. So I'm Mehrun, and what I'm going to be doing for the next 45 minutes or so is to share with you some of what I'm developing from my research. And the study itself is a qualitative piece of research examining stakeholder perceptions of end-of-life care experiences. But I won't be presenting the study as a whole, or we'll be here for a very long time. But what I want to do is focus on the theme of this seminar series, which is biomedicine and Islam, where over the course of this term, speakers will present an exploration of the interconnectivity and relationships between the two fields of knowledge. And what I'd like to do is look at end-of-life care specifically as a case study of this relationship. Now, for better or worse, I'm kicking off the series. So what I want to do is start off by presenting some of the key terms to familiarize you. It's a real privilege to be here. I can spot at least 4 of my teachers in the room, as well as a mentor, so no pressure. Now, what I'd like to do over the course of this talk is four main things. Firstly, outline what we mean by Islam and biomedicine, and then to see how it is that both of these fields of knowledge have a theoretical as well as a practical component. And then to examine key concepts pertaining to end of life that are relevant to both of these fields of knowledge, and how the two fields offer us an understanding of key terms like health, illness, life, and death and dying in particular. And what I'll do then is share some of my research findings to illustrate how these concepts within the scope of end-of-life care help to delineate a juxtaposition between Islam and biomedicine, and how this can be appreciated through the examination of the practice of the two fields, particularly around advanced care planning and values around hope and acceptance. And if we have time, we'll look at quality of life and futility. So, what is biomedicine? Biomedicine, or modern scientific medicine, is titled biomedicine as it employs biology and microbiology as a system or science for understanding health and disease. It thus attaches importance to learning about biochemical systems or subcellular processes, cellular structures, tissue physiology, anatomy, physiological or organ systems to understand health. Health is defined within this biomedical model as a state when these subcellular, cellular, tissue, organ and multi-organ systems are functioning. This function can be measured quantitatively through biochemical, electrical and other empirical modes of measurement. When things go wrong, either through the actions of an external agent or pathogen, such as a virus or a bacterium, and here's TB, or failure of an internal subcellular program, as happens in the case of cancer, the problem or pathology is commonly understood in terms of the physical cause and manifestation. How such problems are dealt with, again, rely on a physical response, for example, through drug therapy or surgical intervention. Now, historically, the biomedical model finds its roots in the germ theory of disease. And the germ theory states that specific microorganisms are the causes of specific diseases. And this theory was developed, proved, and popularized in Europe and North America between 1850 and 1920. And what I'd like to do is step back a little bit to explain that up until that point, the popular model for understanding health and disease was through the humoral theory. And the humoral theory, commonly credited to Hippocrates and Galen, proposed that the human body was comprised of four humors: black bile or melancholy, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. And this model proposed that each individual had a particular humoral makeup or constitution, and health was defined as a proper humoral balance for that individual. An imbalance of the humors resulted in disease. Now, as you can see, the implications of germ theory, this idea that a particular pathogen can cause a particular disease, was a revolutionary idea in terms of understanding health and disease. And it was credited to, amongst others, who were considered, the fathers of modern medicine, Lister, Pasteur, and Koch, who triggered a paradigm shift in the field of medicine through the discovery of antiseptic techniques, vaccines, and proving disease causation by specific germs. And we'll look at the implications of some of these discoveries in terms of our understanding of death and dying in particular. So, germ theory resulted in an enhanced status for laboratory science and for hospital medicine and surgery. It focused attention on a specific etiology and the immediate cause of disease. Germ theory and laboratory science remain important today as doctors rely more and more on laboratory testing to help them diagnose and monitor specific conditions or diseases. However, a specific etiology, a specific microorganism causing a specific disease, did become more contentious in the 1970s, and Engel famously called for a new medical model which emphasized multi-causality, thinking more about cofactors, the host state, as well as the invading organism. Nevertheless, it's important to highlight that proponents of biomedicine suggest that it stands with many great successes, such as the reduction of high mortality rates that were found in the early parts of the 20th century that were caused by organisms like TB. And although there have been challenges to this biomedical model, it is and remains very, very popular. Now, in addition to the germ theory of disease, biomedicine relies on an epistemic framework that is largely empirical. The development of randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis, and the establishment of evidence-based medicine predominates as the sciences and tools of knowing within biomedicine. So, how does this relate to death and dying, coming back to the title of this talk? And how does the biomedical paradigm offer us an understanding of this part of the human story? And we all accept that death is a universal experience in the life narrative of every one of us, yet how we know it, experience it, prepare for it, is heavily influenced by the lens and kaleidoscope that our frames of knowledge and experience provide, and how different people have conceived of death and how those conceptions have shaped their behaviours and practices has varied over time and across cultures. Now, within the biomedical model of health and disease, the emergence of technologies and sophisticated research has altered how we understand death within this paradigm. And there are 4 key questions that I'd like us to consider over the next few minutes or so to try and understand how biomedicine offers us an evolving understanding of death and dying. The first is, what is death? What do we mean by death and how do we define it? How do we die? When do we die? And where do we die? So I'll go through each of these in turn. So, what is death? Throughout time, every major religion, philosophy, and spiritual school of thought has sought to explain death. As human beings, the drive to understand death unites us all now and has done so throughout history, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. It is important to understand how death and dying has been understood within the biomedical paradigm and how that understanding has changed and is likely to continue to change. Why does death and dying and understanding these terms matter? The reason that understanding death and dying matters is because it tells us something about life and about ourselves. Marcus du Sautoy, in his book that was published last year titled What We Cannot Know, wrote that the price you pay for being aware of your existence is having to confront the inevitability of your demise. Death awareness is the price we pay for self-awareness. Now, this is heavily influenced by the idea that death is an end. It's a very powerful and predominant idea, and he presents being aware of death as a price. However, in other cultures and religions, such as Islam, death awareness is a stimulus for preparation and creativity. And this is because death is not understood as an end, but another beginning. And so ideas about death and dying, the preparation for it, are linked closely to notions and understanding about what happens after we die, but also how we live and how life is understood. So what is death? For some it's a beginning and for some an end, and for many simply a state of disrepair when medicine gives up. Is death an absence of life? What is life then, and how is it manifest? And what does it mean to have a life? What does it mean to be alive? Is it a physical state? Is it a mental state? Or something aphysical or spiritual? And is this spiritual or mental idea linked to this notion of consciousness? Marcus du Sautoy also talks about this idea of consciousness as being a predominant understanding of life, such that he proposes this possibility of circumventing death by divorcing ourselves from the vulnerability of our physical bodies by uploading our consciousness into a computer. Anyway, more about that later. So, communities, societies, and cultures were traditionally unified by their views on death and dying. But the views and understandings of death are changing. And I think that's predominantly for 2 reasons. The first is the impact of globalization and multiculturalism means that people in the UK share a multitude of cultures and beliefs. There isn't a monoculture or a single idea that unifies an understanding of death and dying. And the other is that biomedical science has also propelled us into a changing understanding of these 2 paradigms. Now, you may all be familiar that traditionally we've understood death to be the cessation of breathing and the stopping of our heart. Recent biomedical discoveries and progress have challenged this idea, where more of what we understand in terms of the core of our biomedical functions rely on brain activity. And so there is this proposal of death being brain death. Now, the definition, or how we understand brain death, is in itself disputed. And Dr. Asim can tell us more about that. Globally, there isn't really a consensus, nor does research offer a definitive understanding of what death is. Some groups consider brainstem death as being an appropriate definition. Others talk about the whole brain death as being necessary. And I don't want to be too bogged down by this particular idea. What I'd like us to simply understand is there is no consensus. Despite there being a change, we still don't have an answer. So the next question is, how do we die? And this one I really like. Being a public health professional, it's a hobby of mine to show this graph as many times as possible. What we see from the germ theory of disease is this very deep-seated understanding that microorganisms like TB cause disease. And so if we are able to prevent the spread of disease, we can reduce mortality that's associated with it. And this image shows how TB was identified and when antibiotics were introduced, yet the mortality rates associated with TB began to reduce much earlier on. And this was because of health policy interventions like the Clean Air Act. The point of showing this graph is pretty much explained in the next one, which is how we die has changed dramatically. In the 1900s, TB, being the scourge of well-being, caused so many deaths. And what you see in this figure is pneumonia, TB, GI infections were the main cause of disease and death. And now what we have is a paradigm where most of death is caused by what are considered lifestyle conditions. And that's an important paradigm to note in terms of our broader understanding of death and dying. When do we die? And this is another paradigm that is that has changed over the course of the last century as a result of biomedical interventions. You can see from the figure that in 2011, life expectancy almost doubled to what it was in 1841. Is that? Yeah, so you can see it's around about 40 there, and we're hitting the 80s in 2011. And this brings us on to the last of the four questions, which is, where do we die? And traditionally, death was taking place in the community, in people's homes, where people were surrounded by their family members and the community. But because of the institutionalization of the practice of biomedicine and the reliance on the interventions that are associated with that, this has changed dramatically. And Spellman, in his book, writes, "Today in the developed West, death and dying are often kept tidily out of sight, relegated to hospitals, skilled care facilities, or nursing homes." And in his medical nemesis, first published in 1975, also known as The Limits to Medicine, Ivan Illich subjected contemporary Western medicine to a detailed attack. He argued that medicalization in recent decades of so many of life's vicissitudes, birth and death, for example, frequently caused more harm than good and rendered people, in effect, lifelong patients. There's a tension, however, in terms of Ivan Illich's assessment, which is that death and dying in hospitals is not driven by patient preference. Marie Curie did a survey. That wasn't me, was it?
That's right. Proceed.
Death and dying in England, which was a survey carried out by Marie Curie, showed that hospitals are constantly rated by bereaved relatives as providing poorer care, lower levels of dignity and respect for people in last hours and days of life. However, for those who expressed a preference, the majority preferred to die at home, and it was 71% in the survey. However, the most commonly recorded place of death was hospital, which was 53%. Of course, there were gaps in that data. They weren't able to record every death and every preference. But it does highlight to us that more work needs to be done to better understand why it is that patients end up in hospital when they would prefer to spend their last few days and hours at home. Another challenge that's presented in terms of being able to care for people at the end of their life at a place and in a model of care of their preference is something discussed by Henry Marsh in his fascinating book, where he talks about his experience as a neurosurgeon and a key issue or value in healthcare, which is that of trust. And he says, if we are ill and in hospital, fearing for our life, we have to trust the doctors treating us. Now, trust requires a shared understanding. With a multitude of cultures, beliefs, and expectations, healthcare workers and policymakers face a big challenge. People's understanding of death and dying impacts their views and expectations of healthcare and the expectations of the healthcare staff. If there isn't a universal understanding of death and dying, and that this understanding is continuing to change, how do we determine what people's needs are and meet, and have a structure where we can meet those needs? Now, the other caveat is that biomedicine isn't simply the underlying research that we know in terms of biomedical science. The practical manifestation of biomedical science, or medicine, clinical medicine as we understand it, is a combination of these three things: the know what, which we're familiar with in terms of the research and science, but it also consists of the know how, the clinical skills and the training that healthcare professionals undertake, and also what Bloom calls the know why, the underlying motivations and culture that reside within a system of knowledge and action, which is how we recognize biomedicine. Now, in order for the system to be successful, all of these three areas ought to be synergistic, where the whole is more effective than each of the individual parts. It is, however, commonplace amongst medical schools globally for a lot of time and resource to be dedicated to the know what and how, and not the why. So, what I've tried to present thus far is a theoretical understanding of what biomedicine is, how this theory is in fact enacted through a practice, and that both of these offer us an understanding of death and dying, particularly in terms of the definition of death, how we die, where we die, and when we die. And what I'd like to do is now turn to Islam, the sort of the second big heading in this series, and think a little bit about how Islam theoretically and practically offers us an understanding of death and dying, and then bring the two models together in terms of the key values of hope and acceptance around end of life. Sorry, I've got a bad throat. And I just don't want to end up sort of hoarse or being unable to have the conversation with you at the end. So what is Islam? Islam is a religion with a creed or aqidah, fundamental principles or usul, rituals or ibadat, obligations or wajibat, prohibitions or muharramat, and a moral code or akhlaq. It's a way of life that is encapsulated in the Quran, the word of God that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the prophetic example or sunnah that has been carefully documented in books of tradition or ahadith. The figure here illustrates the two primary sources of Islam, which are the Quran and Hadith. These sources have to be interpreted using legal tools such as ijma and qiyas to derive the secondary sciences such as jurisprudence or fiqh. Other presentations in the series will drill down further into the tools of interpretation, and I think Dr. Asim is going to be talking about maqasid at some point. But here what I'd like to focus on is the third level, which is the practice of Muslims as an embodiment of the textual sources and derived sciences. Although there is a plurality within Islam, the source texts and the sciences carry an authoritative weight, as well as an instructive component that is enacted through the behavior and commitment of Muslims. Each of these elements, therefore, contributes to what is understood as the normative sources of Islam. The diagram provides a schematic of the different sources of knowledge, understanding, and practice that Muslims draw on. And what you can see, therefore, is that, like biomedicine, Islam can be considered in terms of its theory and practice. And what we will go on to explore is how, from these fundamental considerations, what emerges as an underlying normative understanding of values such as life, death, health, and illness. So, death and dying within Islam. There is a growing body of literature detailing Islamic theological and legal perspectives on death and dying, and a brief summary of some of these references includes beliefs and understandings that come from the Quran and Hadith that describe that for Muslims, nearing the end of life is considered a transition period before entering another everlasting life. Illness and disease in Islam may be considered suffering incurred by believers as a means of spiritual cleansing, where religious transgressions are manifest as ailments or a means of elevating the devotee. Many Muslims believe they have a duty to seek out medical treatment when ill. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, God has sent both the disease and the cure, and he has appointed a cure for every disease. So treat yourselves medically, but use nothing unlawful. In Islam, humans are considered the stewards of their bodies, which are regarded as gifts from God, and so Muslims may be deeply committed to finding ways of healing. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, referred to the benefits of a long life as a means of accumulating good actions and seeking expiation from sins. He therefore discouraged the requesting of death, as it would reduce the benefit that could be accrued from this life. The accumulation of good deeds from this life is tied to another integral value for Muslims, which is belief in the afterlife and planning for this inevitability. Thus, for Muslims, actions within this worldly existence have an impact on the eternal afterlife. And so, defining death is of critical importance within the Islamic tradition and for Muslims who commit to and practice that tradition, because it has implications on when life-sustaining treatment can be withdrawn, whether organs can be harvested for donation, as well as when to begin the rites of burial and the execution of the deceased's will. Traditionally, death was defined, as we discussed earlier, as a cessation of cardiac output and respiratory activity. Advancements in medical technologies in sustaining and prolonging life have led to controversies over the legally accepted definition of death. Medical experts have developed a concurrent definition, or brainstem death, as is practiced in the UK, where there is no evidence of brainstem function, which would mean that life would cease if life support were to be removed. Within the Islamic ethical framework, there is the principle of urf or custom, which enables reliance on the current opinion of medical professionals, as there is no clear evidence from the Quran or Hadith detailing the definition of death. Despite such views, however, there are minority opinions that challenge brainstem death, and there have been recent instances where Muslim families have legally disputed the medical definition of death. And I'm currently sort of sifting through LexisNexis, which is a way of accessing case law in the UK, and have already come across 10 cases that have gone to the High Court where Muslim families have challenged clinical decisions around resuscitation, withholding and withdrawal of life support, and also the diagnosis of brain death. So, how do the two fields come together? As we saw earlier, the biomedical model has predominated in terms of our understanding of health and disease, and it's important to outline that the curative focus of biomedicine continues to influence understandings of life and death. Outcomes within the biomedical paradigm often hedge death against life, where death is overwhelmingly considered a bad outcome. For health professionals training and practicing within the field, research shows that a dying patient is often viewed as a failure. This understanding inadvertently prevents honest communication between healthcare professionals and patients or families, and it may lead to unnecessary suffering as a result of patients receiving futile medical treatments and or poor symptom management. And this is important to consider in terms of how it is that other frameworks of thinking, learning and acting can offer different understandings of what death is and how that relates to life. So, Margaret Lock, I'm a big fan, and in her groundbreaking study of biomedicine, she examines the underlying culture that resides within biomedicine. She presents an investigation of the meanings and values implicit in biomedical knowledge and practice, and presents specific case studies to illustrate the social processes through which these meanings and values are derived. Locke describes how until recently biomedical science, as with the broader field of science, was assumed to be pristine and beyond the realm of social analysis. However, what she and others have found is that biomedicine is value-laden and ought to be examined through a social sciences lens. They discuss how, and I'm quoting verbatim, various facets of 20th century medicine, including education, research, the creation of medical knowledge, the development and application of technology, and day-to-day medical practice, are pervaded by a value-laden system characteristic of an industrial capitalistic view of the world, in which the idea that science represents an objective and value-free body of knowledge is dominant. So, the field of medical sociology offers us a critical lens for examining the underlying values of biomedicine. However, very little work has been done of this kind at the interface of biomedicine and other ways of thinking. And so this comes on to my research, which is looking at Islam and biomedicine with end of life as a case study. But what I'll do is tell you a little bit more about what I mean by values and why it is that we should be considering the values that underlie biomedicine and the people who are involved within the biomedical model. Clinical care requires careful scientific analysis and reliance on evidence-based medicine. The efficacy of healthcare interventions needs to be carefully scrutinized to ensure the appropriateness for patient care, both in terms of safety and effectiveness. However, these decisions rely not only on rigorous scientific knowledge and analysis, but also on an ethical reasoning. This is because many clinical encounters and decisions require deliberation about a combination of a factual or scientific detail as well as the ethical issues. So although scientific advancements may offer a means of prolonging life, is this what we should do? Or, for example, taking Marcus du Sautoy's example, if biomedicine and the sciences give us the opportunity to upload our consciousness, is this what we ought to do? And how does this fit within our understanding of what death is and the role of death within our understanding of this life and those who commit to them, the belief in an afterlife? So what I've been doing over the course of the last year or so is speaking to different stakeholders involved in end-of-life care in the UK to try and understand what are the sorts of conversations and the underlying tensions and values that emerge within this area. And what I've been trying to do is to use the specific example of Muslims to try and drill down within that specificity to uncover what is universal in terms of end of life. And what I've found is a multitude of themes so far, and the value deliberations that are pertinent to this area include values and beliefs around the sanctity of life, impressing the need to preserve life that may come up against clinical deliberations around futility of interventions. Retaining a sense of hope in the seeking of treatment versus accepting clinical prognostication, and ensuring respect for a patient by making clinical decisions respective of their wishes, whilst working in the absence of an advanced care plan or an advanced directive, and being mindful that a patient's wishes may incorporate familiar religious and cultural concerns that are unfamiliar to the clinical team or unfamiliar to the biomedical model as we understand it, and may be difficult to incorporate within time-sensitive clinical encounters, and that each patient and their individual needs ought to be considered alongside the practical challenges of resource limitations, particularly in the UK setting with a publicly funded healthcare system. Healthcare practitioners deliberate according to scientific analyses and the ethical training of the medical profession, and may also find that they need to balance these commitments with their own personal moral commitments. So, whilst trying to drill down on a lot of these themes, one of the things that I found was common to a lot of groups was this issue of hope. And what I wanted to do was share with you some of my research findings. So, hopes encountered within end-of-life care planning or advanced care planning. For those of you who aren't familiar, advanced care plans are a policy initiative where healthcare professionals who identify a patient as being in the last year of life, either through repeated hospital admissions or as a result of a particular diagnosis, negotiate what they would prefer in terms of their care. And it's a mechanism that is based on the biomedical model of prognostication and palliative care. However, what healthcare professionals encounter when they're administering care for Muslim patients and families is a particular expression of hope. And this is one example of that. A chaplain explaining how for Muslim families this acceptance of biomedical prognostication is particularly challenging because of their understanding of what cure is and their belief that cure resides in the hands of God. Another nurse that I spoke to described how Muslim patients negotiate care with her in terms of a parallel system, where they say, you do what you like and we accept that, but understand that that's not what we believe to be a mechanism we rely on. And what I found is, after speaking to a lot of the different stakeholders, is that this juxtaposition of values around end of life is very poorly understood. So how do we negotiate this issue of hope around end of life and death and dying? And I recommend Michael Barrowland's paper. He describes hope within the Judeo-Christian tradition, and he describes that hope is conditioned neither by past events nor by present needs, and is not necessarily oriented towards the future, especially the distant future, and that hope is related to personal agency and to freedom, and that hope is deliberative and evaluative, motivatory, and rationally critical. And what I'm working on at the moment is looking at the data that I'm collecting and the voices and experiences of people within end of life, and particularly the Muslim context in the UK, to try and derive an understanding of, within the Islamic paradigm, what is hope and how is it intrinsically connected to notions of God consciousness or taqwa, beliefs about cure or shifa, and also understandings of fate in terms of life as we understand it in terms of our current existence, and other notions of life. Maria Christensen and Aziz Sheikh and their team did a study on Muslims and Sikhs in the UK at the end of life, and their analysis was informed by Mattingly's theory of hope. And what they did was articulated notions of hope where religion was one component. What I'd like to do is look at Islamic notions of hope in particular, and see how that can add to the current narrative. And what you see within these encounters of end of life around hope is a dissonance of priorities and values. For healthcare professionals who want to ensure patient needs are met in terms of documenting a preference of place of death, negotiating ceilings of treatment, and establishing a prognostic understanding of the end of life, there may be a dissonance in deep value pairings. And what I found is that the same questions within the biomedical sphere around end of life are navigated differently in the practical spheres of Islamic biomedicine. And this quote is trying to illustrate some of that. If you want me to go back later to sort of put up some of the quotes, I can, but it's just to give you a flavour of some of the data. So what do I mean by deep value pairings? Robert Veitch offers challenges to the conventional biomedical model of negotiating care and coming to an understanding of what patient care ought to look like, particularly around what we mean by consent. And that's essentially what's involved in determining an advanced care plan at the end of life. He suggests that clinicians can't obtain, a valid understanding of what care should look like because they're unaware of which treatment options will ensure the best interests of the patients. He describes a deliberative challenge that healthcare professionals may encounter when trying to implement best interest standards. Veitch proposes that healthcare professionals must firstly determine what will serve the patient's medical or healthcare interests. Secondly, that the medical team must balance the latter interests against the patient's other interests. And thirdly, that the patient's interests, healthcare and other interests, ought to be balanced against other moral goals, responsibilities, including serving the interests of others. And Veitch argues that meeting all of these standards is infeasible, and that in order for clinicians to make better guesses as to what may serve a patient's best interests, patients ought to be paired with providers who share their deep values. The latter would involve pairings on the basis of religion, political, philosophical, and social inclinations. He understandably highlights that achieving such pairings may be challenging or near impossible, yet his critique of the traditional biomedical model of negotiating care and reaching clinical decisions does require further reflection, particularly in terms of what we've discussed thus far in terms of death and dying and how such understandings are evolving and are poorly defined and understood. Now, I'm getting bored of my voice, so I'm going to just sort of fly over the futility and quality of life stuff because I want to talk to you. But what I want to end by saying is even the language we use around death and dying can reduce the meaning. The end of something seems to implicate that it's as though it's a full stop. Is death the opposite of life? Is it within life? Is it just an event? Is it on the same line as life and another life? And understanding death influences how we deal with it. The biomedical construct of death, where we have mortality as a bad outcome, or in some cases, death as being something that ought to be avoided. And you can see this reflected in a lot of biomedical resources being invested in telomere repair, or repairing the ends of our chromosomes to extend life, and also cryonics, which is popular beyond celebrities. Apparently costs £2,000 to freeze yourself until we discover how to wake you up. So this conceptual meaning of death and the values that surround that understanding emphasize the need for greater diversity within such discussions and more scholarship, hopefully. Thank you so much.